I often use when talking about training is that you cannot use a saw to hammer a nail. That means that when you're building a house, in that case your body, you have to use several different tools, type of exercises, but all of these tools have their own purpose and should be used differently. For example, an Olympic lift cannot be programmed the same way as a basic strength lift, which is not programmed the same way as an isolation exercise. For example, the higher an exercise is on the neurological demand, so the harder it is on the nervous system, Olympic lift or deadlift, for example, or body weight exercise, the less variation or variety you can have in the workout. You should stick to that one exercise, and also the further away you should train to failure. When you move toward a more isolated exercise, well, the more often you can change the exercises and the more you need to go to failure. So when you're doing the Olympic lift, then you should use only like one variation per session, for example, and you should stick to that variation for a lot longer, unless you're dealing with a very highly skilled Olympic weightlifter. But if you're working with a football player, for example, and you decide to use the power clean from the hang, then you should stick with the power clean from the hang for 4 to 8 weeks. If you change too often, he doesn't have time to become technically efficient at movement, and he will never progress optimally. When you're going with the Olympic lift, then you should never go close to failure, because you want every rep to be technically solid and focus on acceleration rather than on fatigue. When you go to the basic strength lift, then, well, even there's a difference between the bench press and the deadlift. In the deadlift, you should never go close to failure, focusing on perfect tension, perfect position. On a bench press, because it's less demanding, you can go one rep short of failure, for example, but you should not try to go to failure. If it happens, that's fine, but it shouldn't happen too often. Even when I was my strongest on the bench press, I don't remember missing a rep. Always trying to lift heavier, but never going to the point where you will miss a rep. When you go to isolation or machine or cable movement, then I believe that since they are lower on the neurological scale, then they should be trained closer to failure or to or even past failure, and you can change them much more often. The big basic strength lift can be changed more often than the Olympic lift, but still be stuck in a program for longer. But the isolation exercise can be changed every workout, because there's very little motor learning on those exercises. Same thing, for example, when you're building an Olympic lifting-based workout, don't program it as if you were programming a bodybuilding session. For example, bodybuilding session, I might use 4 exercises for chest. Well, don't use 4 Olympic lift in a workout. It sounds ridiculous, but I've known a coach when I was younger. When I look at a program, well, he would have power clean from the floor for 5 sets, then followed by power clean from the hang for 5 sets, power clean from blocks for 5 sets, and full squat clean for 5 sets, which didn't make sense, but it was based on I'm designing a program for the Olympic lift as if I were designing a bodybuilding program. It's a different animal. Olympic lift, it's better to use less variation, but spend more time on that variation to become more technically efficient. Okay? So you cannot see a clean and program it like you would program a curl, or a bench press like you would program a clean either. Every exercise has its own purpose. Don't use the Olympic lift to build muscle mass. Use the Olympic lift to build power and the capacity to absorb force. Don't use isolation exercise to build maximum strength. Use them to fix a weak link and to build muscle mass. So every tool has its own purpose, and for that reason it should be trained differently and programmed differently.